President Trump has once again set his sights on an ethnic minority in the U.S. He's been harsh at times on Latin Americans, Haitians in Ohio, and now the Somali population in Minnesota. It comes after a number of Somali Americans were caught in an alleged fraud ring. Trump now says he wants all Somalis out of the country.
Most of those people, they have destroyed Minnesota, okay? Minnesota, you have an incompetent governor. You have a crooked governor. He's crooked as hell, but he's incompetent. Waltz he should be ashamed. That beautiful land, that beautiful state, it's a hellhole right now. And the Somalians should be out of here. They've destroyed our country.
What President Trump and most of the public who are attacking our community is not aware of is the success of this great community. And I believe personally that is why we're being targeted, and that's why we're being attacked.
And that's the head of the CARE Minnesota speaking there. Now, joining us from the Minnesota State Capitol is Corin Hoggard, reporter with Fox 9 Twin Cities KMSP. Corin, good to talk to you again. I know that they're having some budget meetings up there that you're covering. But first of all, if you could give us a backstory of how the Twin Cities became such a hub for Somali Americans.
Sure. They, had a civil war that's been ongoing since at least the early 90s, and that is when a lot of them became refugees here. So during that civil war, there have been an estimated million people who have been killed, about 3.8 million people who have fled the country, and just a small portion of them, about 24,000 or so, have been refugees here in Minnesota starting in the early 90s. That community has grown quite a bit. In the Twin Cities alone now, we're estimating about 87,000 Somalis in the state. As a whole, about 104,000 Somalis have become citizens here, or at least are living here now. As far as citizenship is concerned, almost all of them, 95% of them, are American citizens. 58% of the Somalis in Minnesota were born here in the United States, and then of the folks who were not born here, foreign-born Somalis, most of them were also naturalized citizens, about 87%. So all told, that's 95% of the Somalis in Minnesota who are citizens, and just a few thousand who are still making their way through the immigration process.
And as we understand, it's by far the largest Somali American community in the United States. So then explain this alleged $1 billion COVID-19 fraud where reportedly multiple Somali Americans have been accused.
Sure, so it's a number of different fraudulent schemes in social services. We have the Feeding Our Future was the biggest one that has about, I think it's 78 defendants so far, most of them of East African descent, although the alleged ringleader who was recently convicted was Amy Bach, who is a white woman from Minnesota. But, there is nearly $1 billion that has been counted so far in fraud between Feeding Our Future, housing stabilization services, autism centers here, where basically people would find these new social services and kind of find a vulnerability in it and then just kind of pound that really hard and just bring in friends and family and all sorts of people and just overwhelm the system. And most of this was going on during COVID. The checks and balances that should have been in place were not functioning at the time, and they frankly were not corrected as we came out of the pandemic until far too late. Some of them just recently. The housing stabilization services was paused and then completely ended. You mentioned I was covering budget forecasting today. They have recently taken that out of the budget forecast, and so that is one way that they've addressed that. But that is what the president is talking about, is this giant, almost $1 billion worth of fraud in Minnesota, largely carried out by the East African community, including Somalis, although it's just a few dozen of them, and I have talked to quite a few of them who are quite upset, not just at the fraudsters themselves, but also for the kind of reflection on all of them that a few dozen of them have made.
And that was going to be my next question, because as you know, President Trump, has blamed Somali Americans, but also Governor Walz. Do Minnesotans view Walz as a culprit here for allowing this to happen under his watch?
Well, that pretty much depends on your political stripes, and we'll find out for sure how much they hold him accountable in the 2026 election when he is up for a third term. And fraud is the #1 vulnerability that Minnesota Republicans believe Walz has, and so they are attacking him on that on a daily basis. So definitely something where the state missed a lot of fraud that was happening, didn't do enough to address it, didn't do it fast enough, and you know, that is something that the GOP has definitely seized on here. They were not in power for most of this time. They had, you know, there was a Democratic trifecta, 23 and 24. The Republicans came back to a tied House here and took some power in the last year, and they have tried to address fraud, or at least they have given the impression that they have tried to address fraud. They started a committee. That committee hasn't actually produced any legislation at this point, but it's definitely brought the focus on fraud here at the legislature over the last year.
And we know the harsh words that the president has had for Somali Americans. And as I understand, Governor Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Fry have been very supportive of the community. How do Minnesotans feel about the very harsh words uttered by the president and some of his supporters, just saying somehow that, as you say, 95% of Somali Americans are American citizens, but saying somehow that they should leave?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting dynamic too, because, you know, if you read social media, then you'll see a lot of harsh comments directed at Somalis. But if you talk to real people on the streets here, as we've done for the last several days here, not really the same kind of sentiments. And it does depend on who you talk to. But, you know, we even asked a lot of the Republican lawmakers today if they agreed with the president calling Somalis garbage who need to leave the country. And while they would not denounce those words directly, you know, all of them tried to kind of deflect away from that. One of them said, those aren't the words that I would use. And one of them said, you know, I think that the president has this wrong. The problem that's created the fraud in our state is not immigrants and refugees, but he said it was an incompetent governor who's to blame, not the Somali people. Speaker of the House, Lisa Dameth, who is running for governor in 2026, did not really step into the fray there when we asked her if she would denounce the president's words, but she kind of dodged that question. But a lot of Republican lawmakers are kind of trying to disassociate themselves from the harshness of those words while still maintaining that the fraud that a lot of them are connected to is a big problem here in the state.
Corin, I've heard that phrase from elected Republicans here. It's not the words that I would use many, many times, so I was interested to hear that that's what you're being told as well. Corin Hoggard, live from the state capitol in the Twin Cities. Thank you so much for joining us.
You got it, Paris.
And when we come back, O'Hare is on its way to reclaiming the title of world's busiest airport. All right, how about that? But it's causing city leaders some headaches.